The battle for security in Libya. Armed protesters rise up against former rebels in Benghazi. They want powerful militias brought under control. But can the government enforce its authority? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. It's nearly 2 years now since rebel fighters brought down Libya's longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi. But the authorities have yet to form a credible and professional army or even a police force. Instead, they're relying on powerful militias to maintain security. But there's a growing frustration and resentment. Protesters have stormed a militia base in Benghazi where the Libyan uprising began. Fighting involving the Libya Shield Brigade has killed and injured dozens. Protesters want militias to give up their weapons and submit to the full authority of Libya's security forces. But a spokesman for the armed group says the brigade falls under the umbrella of the Defence Ministry. Dominic Kane reports.
A political protest that suddenly turned violent. These demonstrators had marched on the offices of the government-approved Libya Shield Brigade. They were calling for them to disband and a proper national army to take their place. When the protesters started throwing rocks at the building, this was the response they received. In the chaos that followed, the casualty count was high. Armed militias helped overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, and ever since then, many have continued to operate. In some places, the government has encouraged this, while outlawing them in others. And there have been successes, as in Tripoli on Saturday, when more than 1,000 militiamen turned up to hand over their weapons.
What we are doing today is an important step in rebuilding the Libyan army and the country itself. Our strategy is to place these army barracks outside the cities. That's what we've been trying to achieve.
But despite moments like that, elsewhere, militias have been attacking the army more and more often. And despite reinforcements, the security forces have been unable to stem the tide of violence. It's led the Prime Minister to call for all militias to disband. In Benghazi on Saturday, the protesters were adding their voices to that call. But it was hard to hear. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera.
We'll get to our guests in just a few moments, but first, Ibrahim Al-Barghati, Chief of Preventative Security for Libya, is joining us now on the line from Benghazi. Mr. Al-Barghati, your reaction, first of all, to the deteriorating security situation in Benghazi. Who do you hold responsible for it?
Doubtful persons managed to fill in the political and military vacuum following the liberation. It is them who took leading roles in the political process. It is true that there are fighting militias and other units fighting. However, there are certain units who were given legitimacy by the state and they were uploaded by the people, the grassroots masses. However, we are not aware who is fueling anger among the masses against those units who were given legitimacy by the state and by the people, including those who took part in the liberation and provided security following the political and military vacuum following the collapse of the former regime. We are still facing a challenge in terms of security and the remnants of the regime. We are still also facing another challenge of the state and institution. Other people are disfiguring honest men.
But by legitimizing some of these armed groups, aren't you in fact weakening the state's own authority?
Following the liberation, many of the military and security apparatuses were disbanded. Only few honest, honorable men took part in liberating the country, fighting at the front line, then providing security in the liberated areas. Among them, or joining them, were many honest civilians, doctors, lawyers, etc. These security and military apparatuses worked and operated from the beginning under the state institution, namely Defense Ministry and Interior Ministry. And following the liberation, as I said, they were given the same task. Shield of Libya, for example, from the beginning has been operating under and reporting to the army staff directly. It is part of the state institution.
Ibrahim El-Barghati, Chief of Preventative Security for the Libyan government, thanks very much for joining us. Let's now bring in our guests. In Tripoli, Osama Khabar, a political activist and Vice President of the Freedom Fighters Coalition. In Doha, Omar Ashour, a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at Exeter University. And also in Tripoli, Anas El-Gomati, founder and general director of the Sadek Institute, a Libya-based think tank. Anas El-Gomati, just how is the security situation in Benghazi affecting you and other residents of Tripoli? How much of a sense of unease is there about the government's lack of ability or willingness to take on some of the armed groups in the country?
Well, I think it just sort of reflects their basic incapacity, because I don't think we're talking about sincere policies. We're really talking about negotiations. Everything else in economic development, in health, in education, there have been policies that are being enacted and are taking their time. But with security, it's generally a feel that there is some sort of negotiation that's going on across the country. This is also part of a national conversation. And I think with the East, there is a feel that they've somehow been let down by the political process, that they really haven't felt the love, for it, so to speak. And for that reason, many people in Tripoli are kind of worried that the international community have been effectively driven out of the east of the country. And with the recent bombing in Tripoli, which was kind of almost day-to-day or month-to-month activity in Benghazi at some point, people are feeling there is a knock-on effect, effectively, with the armed groups, the militias, those that have ideological motives, that are now seeking to take the battle from Benghazi to Tripoli. And for that reason, I think the sense of unease is quite high. It's impacting every kind of everyday life, whether it's in retail, whether it's in people that Tripoli had this feel of people spending hours at night, sitting out and talking, had that kind of nice Mediterranean conversation feel, which is unfortunately fading away as we speak.
But how much security, though, is there in Tripoli itself? Do you feel that the government is fully in control of the security situation, or is it largely in the hands of those armed groups?
Of course not. I mean, I don't think the official ministries and institutions of the government are functioning. The police, the army, have effectively had or received assassination attempts or threats over the past 2 years. And for that matter, they're severely incapacitated. There's at least 20 to 40% absenteeism from the police. So we don't feel actual, real, tangible, official institutions at work. On the other hand, there are parallel institutions, one of them being the Libya Shield Force, and the Supreme Security Committee, or the Lajna al-Ulya. Both of these forces are revolutionary in nature and are not official. They fall under the command of the MOI, or the Ministry of Interior, and the Ministry of Defense. To keep it short, both of those groupings are not official bodies. They may wear uniforms that reflect their some sense of loyalty to the government, but effectively, there's no sincere command or control. It's a very, very weak structure in that sense. They're ill-disciplined. In terms of money, there are many, many kind of disputes, and day-to-day activities, security is hampered by these kind of disputes because they often lead to violent conflict and violent confrontation. And for that reason, security is weak at best. In terms of level of threat, day-to-day life continues. I mean, it's testimony to the Libyan people that they're a very tenacious bunch and national body, but effectively, in terms of what the governed feel is being done by the governor, it's very little in terms of day-to-day security.
Osama Khabar, a sense of unease clearly among civilians, reflected in the words of Anas El-Gomati. You represent the so-called Freedom Fighters Coalition. What are you fighting for, and who are you fighting against?
Well, first of all, I would like to extend my sincere condolences to all who really died yesterday in this innocent confrontation, I would really call it. It's a very sad day yesterday, and I hope things will be really resolved peacefully today and coming forth. I think what Mr. Gomati has just stated is absolutely right. What we are standing for now, like the revolution is still there. There's no really so-called institutions well established down here. in Libya. So what's really controlling or providing the peace and security in the country and protecting the country is basically the Shield of Libya. These are the freedom fighters who really fought to liberate the country, and in a sense, many of them, they don't want really to join the official army, and they are really doing their job until the official army and the official institutions that belongs to the government stand tall and firm and be capable of defending the country.
But is this about a power struggle? But who are you fighting against?
Will go back to their normal life.
Are you fighting against the government or other factions?
And the country and the official institutions. The Defense Ministry or the Ministry of Interior, they are incapable really of providing internal security, nor capable of really defending the borders of the country. So that's why the Shield of Libya, who like I would say, the core of this Shield of Libya are the freedom fighters, are the ones who are really providing the security inside Libya and protecting the country now.
Omar Ashur, clearly some of the militias are still unwilling to disarm. The government, we heard from a military spokesman moments ago, saying that some groups have legitimacy, that they operate under the control of the government and its defense ministry. Others don't. Just how genuine, though, is the government in tackling the presence of armed groups? Is it still using some of them to settle some tribal conflicts?
It is true. It's a question of capacity, but let me tell you that Libya Shield is a part of the Ministry of Defense. It was used by the Ministry of Defense to settle tribal disputes, most notably in Kufra between February and June 2012. I was in Libya in February 2012 when the ministry and the government celebrated the reintegration of more than 5,000 members, mainly under the command of Libya Shield, and also the Ministry of Interior celebrated the reintegration of some of the brigades under the command of the Ministry of Interior back then. So they do operate, but the problem is more complex than just nominal affiliation with the Ministry of Defense. Part of the problem is what I call the collective reintegration of these brigades. The brigades get integrated in the ministry as a group. The command and control structure belongs to the group commander, not to the Minister of Defense. So they take orders from the group commander, not from the Minister of Defense, and that was so obvious in the Kufra events back in June of 2012 when the Minister of Defense was calling the troops back and the troop commanders were insisting to continue their efforts, which turned out into a combat mission. They were on a conflict resolution mission, not a combat one, but that turned into a combat mission. So this is part of the problem, but the other problem is the armed groups that refuse reintegration, even collective reintegration into the state bodies, into the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense. So those are, they are divided into several categories. One of them is the political categories, groups that have political ambitions. For example, the federalism issue comes to mind, groups that are affiliated with specific political parties, groups that are regional, have regional demands, such as groups in Misrata and Zintan, who are armed and refuse to get integrated into the state structures. They keep their weapons and they operate autonomously. But also there is the ideological dimension as well, groups that don't see the legitimacy of the government and the legitimacy of the state. They don't believe in the electoral process that happened and brought the General National Congress, the GNC. They reject that, and therefore they want to stay outside of the state system, and they have their own ideological body to legitimate that. And then a third division, which is basically the criminal or the economic activity, organized crime activity of some of the groups who are made up mainly of ex-cons that were released under Gaddafi, were able to have access during the revolution to weapons and mid-size and some heavy machine guns as well, and were able to consolidate themselves in such a way. So you have this multiplicity of these groups. Obviously, the question of capacity of the government to reintegrate all this, all to deal with the ones that are outside of its authority, is very difficult. The civilian control over the armed institutions of the Libyan state is not there yet, and there is a long way to go to do so.
Anas Al-Gumati, is the government able to control any of these militias, even if it wanted to? Because not so long ago, just a few weeks ago, we saw some of these armed groups laying siege to some key ministries in Tripoli, the Justice Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, even the Finance Ministry, and making some quite serious demands and asking for political concessions. Is it working? Is the government caving in?
No, I don't think the government has the current capacity to respond to its democratic mandate to, in effect, bring under control, and I think that's the key word here, is to bring under control its Minister of Defence and its Minister of Interior in the way that it seeks to, in order to try and have some semblance of a monopoly on legitimate use of force. In that sense as well, I think it's an obvious one that protests don't lead to deaths. I mean, they shouldn't. In any normal, civilized, decent country, they shouldn't lead to death. And I think the government knows this. What leads to death is when you have a group of people that are ill-disciplined, that lack basic training, and in situations of extreme stress, cannot discern between a protester and an armed individual that is posing a serious threat. And in that sense, Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defence are nice umbrella terms, are nice institutions where we try to think of, some form of legitimacy or some form of a formalization of an institution. But in reality, what is a day-to-day tangible effect on the people? Nothing. Apart from a change in uniform, many people in Libya don't feel that the Ministry of Defence, and this was the key problem yesterday in Benghazi, that many people don't feel that Libya properly represents and properly acts in the name of a Minister of Justice, a Minister of Defence, and that's what leads to deaths. When they're not, when they're not brought under proper control, as Omar has already mentioned, a weak command and control structure, where there are already heads that have not been democratically elected or have not been chosen by the GNC, are already taking command of thousands of men. I mean, you're looking at in excess of 10 to 15,000 people that are under the Ministry of Defence in the east, but go along their own orders. Today in Derna, a city that only lies miles or kilometres away from Benghazi, the state does not exist. Neither does the police, the judicial police, the Ministry of Defence or the army. They don't exist anymore. They have absolutely no presence there. And Benghazi is only the tip of the iceberg.
Osama Khabar, clearly many civilians in Libya want to see a national army in charge of security in the country. Do you accept the legitimacy of the government, its responsibility over security? Are you willing to disarm?
Absolutely, all Libyans would like to see an official army and an official police division working in the country. Everyone really would like to go to that direction. The problem is that people are really in rush and in a hurry. We are still getting out of a fierce revolution. The people who were representing the previous regime are still holding or are still in charge of certain sections in the defense ministry and in the interior ministry, and we don't want these guys really to be in charge of building the new official institutions that will defend the country and will really provide the security.
Omar Ashur, the Prime Minister announced that there would be a formal inquiry into what has happened recently in Benghazi. Just how embarrassing, though, is it for the government that has failed to disarm some of these armed groups and that is accused by some Libyans of legitimizing some groups in order to fill a vacuum that it itself isn't able to do?
Certainly, right now, the government can do some steps towards the DDR process, the demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. One of them is there are multiple leaderships for these armed groups. There are multiple tribal leaders who are interested in exerting some influence over some of the armed formations. The government has the incentive dimension where it can distribute some basically money for arms. The government has also some strong units within the army, like the special forces that was deployed in Benghazi and created some side, obviously, aside from this incident. Before that, there was a bit of calm in the city because of the deployment of the Saqa forces, which is one of the special forces units in the Libyan army that has a strong command and control structure. So there are a few things that you can pressure to further on the DDR process. So some of the behavior of these armed groups is very, very threatening to the democratic transition, and I think the only way Libya's democratic transition, the success of that transition, lies in the DDR process.
Anas Al-Gumati, how do you see the best way forward for the government to regain some sense of authority over the overall political and military situation in the country by allowing some of these armed groups to operate, some would say, above the law? Is the government ultimately weakening its own authority?
I think the DDR process, as Omar has already explained, is an important one, but the government can't be hampered for the next 23 years as it has been in Lebanon with the same process, and I think it has to do two things at once, parallel initiatives, and I think it must ignore the fact that there is a revolutionary narrative here that that the entire world wants to sign up to and try to understand, and start off with a formalized doctrinal beginning, and that's really trying to build a national guard or a new national army with strict guidelines, with people that have no affiliation to ideology. There can be none of these problems of trying to demobilize groups that have different command controls, and I think that's really where they have to start. And I think the political isolation law, whilst it's going to hamper the technocratic ability of the country, and from whatever moral light it may shed in the short term, will shed a massive shadow on the country for the long term. It's no mystery how many thousands of people that have worked inside the government at senior to leadership levels that had no political affiliation to Gaddafi, but for some reason or not could never leave the country and had to work in those things. At the moment, the process seems to be deconstructive, and the government needs to start constructing things. And I think it has a legacy in the East of marginalizing communities in the last 42 years. If it continues this, the symbolic value of yesterday will last for decades, and it can't afford to do that now. It has to start on a building project.
Osama Khabar, are you willing to help the government do this? Are you willing to integrate into and join a national army, and also call on other militias to do the same?
We are not really a militia. We are really working with the government in tandem. Like all the security that we're providing inside the country and to the borders, it is the Shield of Libya that is doing this. I'm telling you, if we really put down our weapons now, the government would not be able to provide any level of security to the cities nor to the borders. We are working together with the Defense Ministry, with Mr. Zidane, in really pushing those institutions forward. This happened in different cases. Like if you remember about 3 weeks ago, the complex of militias, which is an oil or petrochemical institution in the west of Libya. Like there were militia who attacked and took 17 a car from the group who were really providing security to that institution. This just tells you that the army is not really strong enough to defend itself. And Libya is the one that really intervened and provide level of security to that factory. Libya, or the Libya Shield, is really working with the government, is working to protect the country, is working to provide security, and it is to the benefit of the country until the army and the Interior Ministry stand tall and strong and take over.
But is it a good thing for Libya? The country has been described as an incubator of turmoil, awash with weapons and fighters ready for battle at home and abroad. And here's where some of the arms are ending up. A UN report last month said they're finding their way into Egypt and onto the Gaza Strip. They're being smuggled into Africa, into Mali and Somalia, and weapons from Libya are being used in the fight against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So what are the regional ramifications of having so many weapons in so many hands, Omar Ashur?
It's definitely not. The estimates in 2012 was there are 125,000 armed civilians in Libya. Some of those were integrated, as I mentioned, in the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, but mostly, as I mentioned, also collective reintegration. Some did not, and obviously the ones that do not operate autonomously, so in that case, if there is a legislation that they do not agree with, they don't really care whether the GNC was elected or not, so they go and besiege it, and they have the arms to do so. But also, in some cases, they do clash with the forces of the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, including, by the way, Libya Shield. The clashes happen between them and other armed formations. But also on the regional dimension, there is a multiplicity of ramifications. Some of those weapons find their way mainly to Egypt, but also to Syria, which is something good for the Syrian revolution. But at a later stage, we will not know how would this impact the regional situation. But overall, I think it is very critical at the moment to have some sort of civilian control over the armed formations of the state first, of the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense, and then at a later stage use these ministries to perform a better reintegration process in Libya.
Omar Ashur, Osama Khabar and Anas Al-Gumati, thank you all very much indeed for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for being with us. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team, thanks for watching.